My name is Joel Yelich. Last name is Yelich. I am a senior researcher and I work at the University of Idaho at the Nancy M. Cummings Research Extension office in Carmen, Idaho.
I am Jay Smith, SMITH. My wife Cheyenne and I own and operate J. Lazy S. Angus Ranch. We are permittees and been part of the research project here with the University of Idaho.
Okay, so the title of our presentation is Use of Virtual Fence on Public Lands Post-Wildfire. And I am going to kind of let Jay give the introduction to talk a little bit about how this whole project started, why it started, and then we'll go into discussing the details of the project. So you want to go ahead, Jay, and kind of talk a little bit about how the project started?
Yeah, you bet. So the Moose Fire in Idaho of 2022 ended up being about 130,000 acres, and it completely went around our 65 or 70,000 acre grazing allotment. Post fire, later that fall, we went up and did a self-assessment, and we could see that about 40,000 or so of the very best acres didn't actually burn or didn't burn severely. So we went home and thought about it, and just really in our guts didn't feel that staying home for 2 to 3 years was the right answer for the ranch or for the land, for the ecology of the land. So we dreamed about virtual fence for a while. We didn't dream about being pioneers in it, but we did dream about using it. And we knew that the University of Idaho already had one research project slated to begin that year. So we went to them and asked if that was a possibility, and through a lot of conversations and work with the BLM and Forest Service, we were able to get the project on the ground.
Okay, thank you. And I'll probably have you fill in on some topics as we get through the presentation here. So like Jay said, we had the wildfire, and as most people know, wildfires are tending to become more popular in the Mountain West and Far West region, and it's made a lot of challenges for us dealing with this when we're talking about public lands and grazing on public lands. Most of the time when we deal with fire on public lands, we're going to have deferred grazing, and that can be anywhere from 1 to 3 years. It's dependent on the burn severity. It's also dependent on the agency, and even agencies within locations within states sometimes have different philosophies on how they handle grazing post-burn. And as Jay said, there were different options that can happen once you have to deal with these. One, you could sell all your cattle. Two, you could lease additional private grazing, but you have location and cost issues of whether or not you're going to be able to do that. You certainly could purchase alternative feeds, not put your cattle out, but that, again, because of economic challenge, if you're fortunate enough, there may be other public grazing within your area that you could go to, but again, that's going to be location, whether it fits your time schedule. And I think you can see that this all comes with economic implications, and those would be both short and long-term implications. So as Jay described, we had the fact is with most public lands, you're going to have deferred grazing for 1 to 3 years. And a lot of that's dependent on burn severity, agency dependent. Also, agencies within particular states may have different philosophies on that, how that's done. But this really puts permittees in a challenging situation with very few options. One of them could be sell all cattle. And I think particularly in Jay and Cheyenne's option, that wasn't necessarily what they wanted to do, for multiple reasons.
Yeah, well, for one, we were at the beginning of an upward cattle cycle, so we didn't want to lose out economically. And B, we have purebred cattle, and so we've invested for decades in our genetics, and you can't just sell them and rebuy them. It's not apples and apples. So we were very invested in keeping our genetics and keeping our cattle and keeping our livelihood intact.
Okay, so that's a really good explanation that was part of this issue. The other thing you can do is you could lease a private grazing, location and cost issues. There's really not very much private grazing where we are, in northeastern Idaho. You could certainly purchase alternative feeds, but that becomes an issue of cost. Um, if you're fortunate enough, you may have some other allotments that you could go to. But again, that becomes location, duration, and also agency issues with that. So I think you have significant economic implications if you can't go out and you can't graze, both short term and long term, as Jay described. So with this particular burn, it was interesting and it was very what we call a mosaic burn, and that we had some areas that were severely burned. We had some areas, particularly our riparian meadows, riparian areas and meadows that weren't burned, and then some areas that were kind of moderately burned. And so I think that led to a lot of their decision that we had a lot of forage available in some of these slightly burned and non-burned areas that should allow us to graze some animals on the allotment. This is a satellite issue image that shows the burn severity classifications. And you can see there's a big green area here in the middle that didn't get burned. And then on the west side, significant burn areas, and then significant burn areas that are kind of interspersed throughout the allotment. And so the fact that we had this large green area in the middle that was not burned, and we had quite a bit of low burned areas, it really opened the opportunity to do some potential grazing. So that's where virtual fence came in. We at the university were actually working on another project at the time when we were approached by Jay and some of the other permittees to use virtual fence. And we kind of modeled it after a fire in Colorado that had occurred probably somewhere around 2000, the East Troublesome Fire, where they actually used virtual fence to graze post-fire on a smaller scale. The system that we used for our grazing was the Vince virtual fence platform. I'm not going to go into great detail, but essentially the cattle have GPS collars on them, which we can use to detect the animals, where they're grazing, and then through our base stations that have the radio signal that emits from it, we can also communicate with the cattle based on changing collar or changing virtual fence boundaries, in those scenarios like that. And then we work through that base station with a cellular network and work on the cloud to be able to see our animals on the computer. And so with this particular system, we only collar the cows. We do not collar calves, which is pretty typical of most virtual fence systems. So this allowed us to be able to build virtual fences where we wanted to, and then also be able to have near real-time monitoring of the livestock because of the GPS satellite capabilities of the collars. The other thing that works well with virtual fences, it's what they call a one-way gate, meaning that when we train the animals, we train them to the sound and the shock of the gate. And when they hit those sound and shock systems, that's where the pressure is. And through associative learning, it forces them back into the pasture. If they do breach it, they have the opportunity to come back through the virtual fence without any pressure. And that really helps permittees if you get a large group of animals that get out, that you can go out, you can move them back in. You don't have to worry about opening gates or anything like that. So that's another issue that works really well, particularly in our scenario, where it was the first time we had used these collars on these cattle, and we weren't sure what to actually expect. The other thing that we did with our base stations is we made mobile base stations, which is what most people in the far west are using now, just because it gives you expanded coverage capabilities. Working with the BLM and the Forest Service, it's listed as a temporary range improvement. So we don't have to move these things every 14 days. And once we're done with them, we can move them to different areas. And so that really helped us increase our coverage area. And we were able to actually get to areas with the mobile base stations fairly easily. This is an example of what a coverage map looks like. And in this particular case, you can see the green is where we have radio coverage. So the way the base stations work is they emit the radio coverage. That's what communicates with the callers. And then once that information comes back to the base station, like I said, you have the cell service, and that's what we can actually use to communicate with the base station and look at the stuff on the computer. In this particular diagram, you can see kind of our black polygons that we've drawn here. This is a area where we were able to graze, and you can see that for the most part we have really good coverage with our radio signals, and in the areas that we don't, those tended to be areas where they were in the middle of the allotment, and we really weren't too worried about tracking cattle because we knew they were supposed to be, but we had really good coverage on our boundaries. And if we needed to change anything, we could move a base station around to get better coverage. So I think in ours, and I think everybody would agree that the collaboration is key in making it work in this particular scenario. I think you have to have a positive relationship with your land agencies. And in our case, in the Lemhi Valley, they probably have a pretty good relationship compared to other areas. And I think Jay probably has more to say about that.
We are very fortunate here in the salmon area, and as a past president of the Idaho Cattle Association, we worked on many range issues across the state, and every time I was always grateful to come back home where these agency folks are actually our neighbors, and we tend to get along and make things work a lot better here in Lemhi County than they tend to be in other parts of the state.
Yeah, and that's well said, because I think that really helped with this project. The other thing is to start to meet as early as possible. We started meeting within a couple months after the fire, once the project was proposed to us. We talked about how the technology works with all of our partners in these meetings, and those included both of the land agencies, BLM and Forest Service together, us from the University of Idaho. We had Fish and Game, Idaho State Department of Agriculture, local representatives, county agents, sometimes the producers were there. So we had a lot of people that worked with these meetings. We developed the land management plan, looking at the stuff that was grazable, the stuff that wasn't grazable, what would be potentially grazable based on satellite images, and then also groundwork of going out and looking at the areas that we wanted to potentially graze. We did some pre-grazing monitoring so that we could look at forage production over time. And I'll talk about how important that was as we moved along in the grazing process. And then we finalized our grazing plan with virtual boundaries, exclusion zones on those high burned areas. And then basically calculated the number of cattle that we were going to be able to put out. And certainly again here, which is kind of an oxymoron for dealing with federal agencies, but flexibility was the key here. And they were probably a little more flexible, I think, in some cases than we thought they would be. And then in other cases, they weren't as flexible in certain issues. And then we did post-grazing monitoring and then a project debriefing at the end. This is the allotment, and it's basically 700 cow-calf pairs with roughly 3 permittees. There's 3 different types of scenarios as far as grazing. You start off with the BLM early in the year in May, then you go to the middle forest from June to mid-July, and then finally on to the upper forest. And with that said, this allotment has some challenges, I think, that Jay can kind of explain on how they actually would like to graze the animals and how they actually graze as they move through the allotment.
Yeah, you can see the lines on the map, but there actually are no physical fences between the BLM, the middle forest, and the upper forest. And so even before the fire, we had continual issues of keeping cattle from coming down and being on the BLM season long, and issues with cattle going over the top too soon, and in some instances not allowing for range readiness. You know, shoot, sometimes those cows would be up there literally eating under a snowbank. So with the virtual fence, we were able to contain those boundaries extremely well. And with that said, our utilization and our forage availability went way up. Our BLM usage averaged 5% or less the last 2 years, and then allowing that range readiness in the high country. Joel can speak to the numbers, but I know we left a lot of grass behind where a lot of years we didn't.
Yeah, that's a good explanation there. So this is kind of what it looked like when we went out. The red areas are our exclusion zones. Those can be a combination of severe fire burned areas. We also have on the west side the Salmon Municipal Water Supply that they really like to keep cattle out of. And then you can see up on top, we have some exclusion areas in red that were severe burn areas that were anywhere from 20 acres to about 200, 300 acres in size that we wanted to keep those cattle out of. So we started with the BLM. You can see the yellow area. The producers went out basically in 3 areas. Here on the west end, a group went out. They went out in the middle with another group. And then they went out here on the north end with another group with 300 cow-calf pairs, which is 400 less than what they typically have the opportunity to go out with. We had pretty good containment, averaged anywhere from 70 to 95% of keeping cows within this yellow boundary. It was very much herd dependent. We'll come back to that. We were able to keep a high percentage of animals off that lower forest, which Jay just kind of talked about, which is important. And then again, we didn't have any collared cows that got up here on the upper forest during that time period, which is usually a challenge of those animals getting up there pretty quickly. The next grazing stage was the middle forest, June 15th, July 15th. And you can see the area in the yellow here. This area above the lower forest is also a severe burn area that cattle were kept out of. Containment again, 75 to 95% of keeping those animals within that yellow border. Very herd dependent. Again, we had no collared cows that we detected that got up to the top. But as Jay said, by being able to place this virtual fence on the lower end of the interface between the BLM and the Forest Service, we limited cows going back to the grazed area, previously grazed area of the BLM, and also kept them out of the water management, and a real good job of keeping them out of the burned areas. Oops. The other thing that happened during this time is that we were in a summer that we had basically record rainfall for how long was that?
All summer. It was the ideal summer for recovering after a forest fire.
And so what we were able to see is that we actually did a kind of a mid-grazing forage assessment. And they actually were flexible and let us stay on that middle forest for almost another 10 days. Because we had so much more grass available, with the feeling that we would give the upper forest a little bit more time to be able to progress. And then the other thing that they decided at that time is based on the amount of forage that was up on the top, based on forage analysis that we went up and did forage samples and monitoring, they allowed the permittees to put another 100 cow-calf pairs out. And so as we went over the top onto the upper forest, I think we had each individual permittee was allowed to put a few extra animals on as we went to the upper forest. And so that actually is a good sign of managed grazing and flexibility, which is something I hope that we can start to use more of in the future on our public lands. Our containment was really good when we got up on top. We'll talk about this lower end here in a minute. Almost all the cows were contained up in this upper part. We had very few that came down to this previously grazed area. And that helped in letting that grass recover throughout the rest of the summer. The other thing that the virtual fence did is once we were on top and near our date of moving off, it really helped with facilitated movement of cattle off the allotment because the permittees knew where the cows were and then knew how many were there. And it really helped them move cows off the allotment after that October 10th date. This is a heat map to kind of show where we had a lot of our cattle grazing. The red area is indicative of cattle grazing, and you can see in the areas on the lower forest and the BLM where we had grazing. You also will see the areas where we tended to have some of our breaches and where those breaches occurred. And you can see that most of those breaches were on the west side. So there's one here, there's one down here, and there's one over here on the northwest corner of where they weren't supposed to be. And part of that is there was an issue with some uncollared animals that got mixed in with our collared cows. And as a result, it makes it a little bit more challenging to manage those collared cows when you have uncollared cows in with them. Other than that little issue there, you can see with the rest of the allotment that we did a good job of keeping them out of the burned areas and keeping them where they needed to be for grazing. The other thing that we were able to detect with this is kind of something that came upon us, unfortunately, is we had some predator response. This is a pretty highly popular area for wolves. And this was a scenario, it's a little bit long, but as we go through here, I'll kind of have Jay talk about this a little bit. But we were able to actually kind of watch in real time animals that had a predator response. Because earlier this morning on August 11th, we actually had a calf that was found down here that was hamstrung by Jay and Cheyenne's family. And then you can see later that day after that attack, the cows start to move off of the allotment, coming all the way down into the upper or the middle forest. And there were I think there were 12 to 15 cows in that group over a half a day period. And you'll eventually notice all of these red dots are going to disappear. And those are all the cows that moved down off the allotment. So this, I think, maybe gives us an opportunity to work with this and maybe develop some tools where we can maybe mitigate some of these predator responses. We had another predator response this year that was farther back here that was the same type of action. We had 15 cows that came all the way off the allotment. And then in 2024 grazing, we also have predator response of 3 more groups that were affected like this. And so hopefully we can start to use this to mitigate some of this. And in the end, our forage monitoring and utilization that we did, you can see that this is based on all of the rain that we got that year, how well some of this moderate burn forage came back in. You can see what we have in our no graze severe burns. Um, this is actually a moderate or a slight burned area that they allowed us to graze, and we only had 26% utilization in it. And then we had our big meadows where we had a real large range. But I also think it's important to make a comment about the meadows and the grazing and how much forage there was compared to previous years. I think your dad made a comment that he'd never seen the meadows look that good.
Well, and they also made the comment that it was the first time in 74, 75 years that they didn't see cows on them early. So we fundamentally made a change in how the cattle behave and how the range responded to that.
And so when you looked at our final utilization, our lower forest was anywhere from 9 to 16%. Our BLM was even lower than that. It was like 5%, and our upper forest was 34%. So we did really well there. So what are our wins? Certainly we did a pretty good job containing cattle. There are certainly terrain effects and cow-calf pair challenges. Excluded most of the cattle from severe to moderate burn areas. Not all of them, but all in all, based on the fact that all of the challenges that we were faced with, the fact that the first time that we had ever done this, I think we were really successful. We had pretty good real-time monitoring of cattle during the grazing season. I think it's critical that you have adequate radio coverage of your area, if at all possible. And we were fortunate enough that we were able to do that. If cattle did breach some of the boundaries, we almost always used a secondary virtual fence to kind of herd them back into the main group, which really decreased emergency riding almost in half or non-existent.
Right. It not only decreased the emergency riding, but when we did need to do emergency riding, we knew exactly what the issue was, exactly where we needed to go and how many resources we needed to send. Where pre-virtual fence and pre-GPS, it would have just been a shotgun approach of constant monitoring, constant riding. So we were really happy with our resource allocation.
And as we've indicated, it really helped with moving cattle off the allotment. And I think we had almost everything off the allotment within a week and a half, 2 weeks after the off date. And almost all, the majority of them were actually off within a week after the off date.
And in the 2023 season, with that abnormally high precipitation, those cattle did not want to come home at all. And without this technology, we wouldn't have been anywhere near that home time. We literally had to go find every cow and push her all the way home. If you pushed her halfway home, she'd turn around and go back.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Because once those cattle would be moved down, I would set fences behind them so that they couldn't go back, and most of them respected that pretty well. Again, we kept a lot of cattle off the upper forest, which really allowed for the extra time for the forage to grow on those meadows. We did the staged grazing all the way up the mountain, which really helped in a uniformity of utilization. Reduce the cattle in the non-grazable burn areas. We just talked about decreasing emergency riding and more effective riding instead. Certainly, this is a wildlife friendly issue because we can eliminate a lot of those physical fences. And then the potential to monitor cattle during predator activity. So what were some of the negatives? It wasn't always perfect. There were a few. We did have some collar retention issues. We were using metal ties, almost like a zip tie, and we probably lost about 35–40% of the collars by the end of the experiment. And that has really changed now, where we've went to a metal carabiner, and we've reduced that to probably less than 15% now. It's not always 100% effective with cow-calf pairs. We have cows that don't respond to the sound and shock. Usually they estimate about 10%, which is probably what we had. Probably had some animals that this is the first time we ever used it on them. So that also makes a difference. And it was also herd dependent too. we had some herds that, or groups of animals that those animals never got out. So we could probably use these for calling decisions. We did have some battery lifespan issues by the time we got to the end of the project. And I think there's some reasons for that, in that this being the first time, learning where to put boundaries, learning not where to put boundaries, cattle pushing against those boundaries a lot. That's a big energy drain on the collar. And certainly in 2024, we have not seen the battery use issues that we saw when we did this in the first year of the project. We do need to make sure we have adequate training, 4 to 6 days. I didn't go through that protocol, but usually 4 to 6 days. You don't want to go any less than that. And then all cows need to be collared. We had the unfortunate incident of having some uncollared cows in with the groups, and that really caused most of the issues. And fortunately, it was only on one section of the allotment. And so in 2024, when we've done this project, we didn't have those issues, and it really made a huge difference. I think it's important that we thank all of our partners that worked on this. Certainly a collaborative effort. We had the permittees, the McFarland family, Jay and Cheyenne Smith and their family, John Aldous Jr. And I've got my little map over here to show you exactly where we are in Idaho. The BLM, Vince and Colton were a big help. The Forest Service, we primarily worked with Kyle Nelson and Tina Ruffling. They were a big help. They also provided some financial funding for base stations. Idaho State Department of Agriculture, they helped us with a lot of the monitoring. The Idaho Cattle Association helped with financial funding to purchase collars or rent collars through part of their program for helping with grazing land that had been burned. And so they were a big help with that. And then certainly us at the University of Idaho, myself, Melinda Ellison, Jim Sprinkle. And then we also got some money from College of Natural Resources, the little endowment funding to help rent some of the collars. And then the people at Vince, particularly Nathaniel Slinkert, helping with all of the collar issues and radio coverage areas. So with any questions or any last comments from Jay that you may have. I think we summed it up. I think we were really happy with the project. It took a lot of work from a lot of different people, a lot of collaboration, and people that were willing to take a chance with us to be able to do it, and put into a situation that was pretty challenging to begin with, based on an allotment that animals went out into different places. They actually went places that they'd never been before, which I think affected some of their grazing capabilities. So thank you.